It began with whispers, quiet at first, like faint ripples on still water. Relatives who once smiled in her presence now shared glances heavy with unspoken envy. Villagers who once admired her kindness began to mutter in corners, their voices tinged with suspicion and bitterness. The girl, with her unassuming beauty and serene connection to the river, became a source of unease. People questioned how someone so young could hold such influence, how a girl with no wealth or power could draw the affection of nature itself. Some said her beauty was too radiant, a light that outshone others and left them in shadow. Others claimed her wisdom was unnatural, for how could she, without years of hardship, speak words that carried the weight of truth? Her relatives in particular felt the sharpest sting of jealousy. They had always considered themselves worthy of respect, but the girl's quiet grace drew more admiration than their loud boasts or shallow deeds. She never sought attention, yet it followed her as naturally as the river followed its course. Children listened more eagerly to her stories than to their elders, and villagers seemed to trust her instincts more than the authority of bloodlines or traditions. To her kin this was intolerable. They began to see her not as family but as a rival, an obstacle that cast their own inadequacies into the light. The river itself only deepened their resentment. Whenever she touched its waters, something miraculous seemed to occur. Fish grew plentiful, the current flowed more gently, or the reflections shimmered with a strange, otherworldly glow. To her, these were gifts of companionship, quiet exchanges between her soul and the spirit of the waters. To others they were signs of unnatural favor. Some villagers whispered that she had bargained with spirits, that her beauty and her gifts were not blessings but dangerous powers that set her apart. It did not matter that she lived simply, wore no ornaments and asked for nothing. Suspicion needs little soil to grow, and in their hearts, it began to take root. Women muttered that she was too beautiful, her face too pure, her hair too radiant in the sunlight. They feared that her presence made others look past them, that their own worth seemed diminished in comparison. Men, some captivated by her quiet charm, spoke of her with admiration, but even that admiration sowed discord in their households, breeding resentment among wives and daughters. Beauty, which she never sought to flaunt, became a weapon turned against her, wielded by the bitterness of others. Her wisdom too drew hostility. She had a way of seeing truths others ignored. When crops failed, she would suggest a simple change in planting near the riverbanks, and the land would flourish again. When a child fell ill, she would bring herbs gathered from damp stones by the water, and often the child would recover. To her it was common sense, the river guiding her hand. But to her relatives it was a threat. Her advice made their authority seem foolish, their decisions pale in comparison. And so the whispers grew louder. They painted her kindness as cunning, her humility as pride, her gifts as curses waiting to unravel. Relatives met in hushed gatherings, fanning their envy into flames of hatred. Villagers joined in, their resentment mixing with fear until her very presence seemed like a storm on the horizon. They told themselves they were right to feel this way, that no one should hold such beauty, wisdom, and favor without paying a price. One relative, her aunt, was the first to speak venom aloud. "She is not like us," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "She thinks herself better, hiding behind her innocence. The river has claimed her, but at what cost to the rest of us? Will we let her shine while we live in her shadow?" Others nodded, their own insecurities feeding on her words. What began as envy hardened into something darker, something dangerous. The villagers, too, began to twist their perceptions of her. Where once they saw a girl who comforted children, they now claimed she was luring the young with strange powers. Where once they admired her closeness to the river, they now said she was hiding secrets in its depths. Even the smallest of gestures, a smile, a moment of silence, a gaze into the water, was reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. Their fears fed one another, and soon the whispers of envy became a chorus of hatred. She remained unaware of the storm gathering around her. She continued to walk the riverbanks, offering kindness to those in need, her heart untouched by malice. Yet behind closed doors her fate was already being discussed, planned, and sealed. Seeds of hatred had been sown, and like weeds left untended, they would grow wild, choking out reason and compassion until cruelty became inevitable. It began in hushed corners, beneath the glow of flickering lamps, and in the shadows of mud-walled houses where no one else could hear. Those who envied her gathered together, their voices low, weaving their bitterness into a net of lies. They no longer whispered only about her beauty or her closeness to the river. They began to craft stories, dangerous stories, that could poison the minds of the entire village. "She is cursed," one relative said, her eyes narrow with malice. The river obeys her because it is bound to her soul. This is not a blessing, it is a warning. Another leaned closer, her voice sharp with spite. If she stays among us, she will bring ruin. Have you not noticed how the rains are heavier, how the river swells when she walks by it? She is no ordinary girl. She is dangerous. Fear is a seed that grows faster than truth. Each whisper planted suspicion in another heart. By the time their secret meetings grew larger, what began as envy had twisted into a shared belief that the girl was not just different but a threat. They convinced themselves that her innocence was a mask, that her kindness hid something sinister. They told one another that beauty like hers could not be natural, that wisdom so pure must come from spirits best left untrusted. The villagers too began to absorb the poison. At first they only listened from a distance, curious at the hushed tones and fearful glances. But as more stories spread, they began to repeat them. A fisherman swore that when she walked past, the river pulled harder against his net. A mother claimed her child had fallen sick after drinking water from the stream where the girl had bathed. None of these stories held truth, but truth mattered little against fear and envy. Repeated often enough, a lie begins to sound like fact. Relatives took advantage of these fears. In the gatherings of elders, they dropped careful hints, wrapping their hatred in the disguise of concern. "We love her but we worry," they would say, lowering their voices. "Perhaps the spirits favor her too much. Perhaps it is dangerous for us to live beside someone so marked." And when others hesitated, they pressed harder. "What if her presence curses our crops? What if the river rises against us? Would we risk our children's lives to protect her?" The idea of removing her took root like a thorny vine, creeping into every discussion, tightening until it seemed inevitable. They spoke less of her kindness and more of their fears. They convinced themselves that getting rid of her was not cruelty but necessity. They did not say aloud that they wanted her gone because she overshadowed them. Instead, they framed it as protection. Protection for the village, protection for the children, protection from some imagined curse. And so, the conspiracy deepened. They met at night, away from curious ears, and crafted their plot in detail. Some wanted her cast out, abandoned to the wilderness where no one could find her. Others whispered darker suggestions, to tie stones to her ankles and let the river decide her fate. To them it felt fitting, if she was bound to the river, then the water should claim her. Each idea was cruel, but in their hearts, cruelty had already become justice. They swore each other to secrecy, but secrecy in such matters only feeds the flames. Soon the village buzzed with unease. No one spoke openly but glances passed like shadows. When she walked by, conversations died mid-sentence. When she knelt by the river, gathering water, eyes followed her, filled not with admiration but with suspicion. She could feel it, the shift in the air, though she did not yet know its cause. Where once her presence brought warmth, now it drew silence, fear, and hidden malice. Her enemies grew bolder. They began to plant signs against her, breaking pots near her doorway and claiming it was the work of spirits, placing dead birds in her path and whispering that she carried omens of death. These cruelties were meant to prepare the others, to paint her not as an innocent girl but as a cursed being who deserved whatever fate awaited her. The more they plotted, the more they convinced themselves of their righteousness. In their minds she had already become something less than human, a shadow, a danger, an enemy. It no longer felt like betrayal, it felt like survival. The bond she had with the river, once seen as a gift, had been twisted into proof of guilt. Her beauty, once admired, was now labeled a trap. Her wisdom, once respected, became the sign of witchcraft. And so the wicked plot solidified. In the secrecy of their gatherings they decided her fate. They would take her away from the safety of the village and deliver her to the waters she loved so dearly. "Let the river keep her," one relative said coldly, and the others agreed. Their whispers, once harmless envy, had now grown into a storm. And at the center of it stood an innocent girl, unaware that those who smiled at her by day were preparing to destroy her by night. The night of betrayal came cloaked in silence, yet heavy with intent. The moon hid behind drifting clouds as though it, too, did not wish to witness what was about to unfold. The villagers who had plotted so long moved with caution, their torches dimmed, their voices hushed to whispers that carried like snakes through the still air. They had chosen this night carefully. The river was swollen from recent rains, its current strong enough to carry away anything tossed into its depths. It was the perfect accomplice to their cruelty. The girl, unaware of what had been decided, lay in her small hut at the edge of the village. Her sleep was peaceful, her breathing steady, and she dreamed of the river she loved, its gentle flow and soothing whispers. She did not hear the creak of footsteps outside, nor the murmurs of those gathered at her door. With a sudden force, the door was pulled open and rough hands seized her. She awoke with a startled cry, confusion flashing in her wide eyes as figures loomed in the darkness. What have I done?" she asked, her voice trembling as they dragged her from her bed. Her words fell on deaf ears. The villagers avoided her gaze, their faces hardened, their hearts steeled by lies they had repeated so often they now believed them. Rope was wound tightly around her wrists, biting into her skin. She struggled, tears spilling down her cheeks, but her cries only fueled their determination. To them, her fear was not innocence, it was proof of guilt. They carried her through the silent village, their torches flickering against the mud walls and thatched roofs. The air was thick with tension, but no one came to her aid. Those who had once admired her beauty and kindness now peeked from behind shutters, too afraid to intervene, too eager to let the river take the burden away. The night was cruel not only in action but in its silence. The silence of neighbors, the silence of kin, the silence of an entire community complicit in betrayal. When they reached the riverbank, the girl fell to her knees in the damp earth, staring at the water that had always been her companion. It reflected the faint light of the torches, rippling with a restless energy as though it already knew what was to come. "Please," she begged, turning her tear-streaked face toward them, "I have done no harm. The river is my friend, not a curse. You mistake envy for truth. Please do not do this." But the conspirators hardened their hearts. They bound stones to her ankles, their rough hands tugging the knots tight, ensuring she could not rise once the river swallowed her. Her cries grew louder, desperation clinging to every word, but they only pressed forward. One whispered, almost as if to reassure himself, "This is for the good of the village." Another muttered, "She is cursed. The river will keep her where she belongs." With one final effort she struggled against them, her body twisting, her voice rising in a heart-wrenching plea. "The river hears me. The river knows me. If you do this, it will not forget." For a fleeting moment, hesitation flickered in the eyes of one or two, but the weight of the crowd, the venom of their envy, and the momentum of their cruelty drowned any second thoughts. They dragged her into the water. The cold river clutched at her ankles, then her knees, then her waist, until she was submerged. Her scream carried across the surface, shattering the night's silence, then dissolved into gurgling cries as the current pulled her down. The torches wavered in the hands of those who watched, their light dancing across the water that closed over her head. Bubbles broke the surface, then stilled. The river swallowed her, her body vanishing into its dark depths. The villagers stood in silence, their breathing heavy, their faces pale. They waited, as though expecting the river to erupt in immediate protest. But nothing happened. The water flowed on, calm and steady, carrying only faint ripples where she had disappeared. A few let out uneasy sighs of relief. "It is done," one whispered. "She is gone." Another muttered, "Now we are safe." But even as they turned away, there lingered in the air a weight they could not name, a sense that the river's silence was not acceptance but patience. That night, the village returned to its uneasy slumber. Doors closed, torches snuffed, and the river flowed quietly, holding beneath its surface the body of a girl betrayed by those she once called her own. Yet in its depths, something stirred, something that did not belong to death or silence. The villagers thought they had rid themselves of her, but they had only given her to the one ally they could never control. The river had taken her, yes, but it had not forgotten. The river settled into a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. Where moments earlier it had churned with her struggle, now it lay still, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. The villagers, their breaths ragged from the effort of binding and pushing her down, stood frozen at the bank. The water looked almost peaceful, as though it had eagerly swallowed her, leaving no trace of her body, no ripple, no sound. For a long moment no one dared to move. The torches flickered in their trembling hands, the smoke curling into the night air. Their ears strained for the faintest cry, some final plea, but nothing rose from beneath the current. The river had claimed her completely. Relief began to creep into their hearts, cautious at first, then growing stronger as the silence stretched on. One of them exhaled sharply and whispered, "It is done. She is gone." Another nodded, though his hands still shook. "The river has taken her. It will keep her there forever." Their voices carried a false confidence, as if speaking the words aloud could quiet the unease inside them. But the longer they stared at the smooth water, the more they began to convince themselves of their success. The villagers turned away in pairs and small groups, their shadows stretching long under the moonlight. Some whispered that peace would return now, that the uneasiness she brought with her strange bond to the river would be washed away with her. Others muttered that the village would prosper again, free from the girl's so-called curse. In their hearts, envy had dressed itself as victory. And yet, as they left, not one of them dared to look back too long at the river. Its calmness felt too complete, too heavy, as if it were holding its breath. The stillness carried a weight that unsettled the air. Frogs along the bank, usually loud with their croaking, were strangely quiet. Even the night birds kept their distance, their calls absent. Nature itself seemed to acknowledge that something unnatural had just occurred. The village slept uneasily that night, though most forced themselves to believe the matter was over. Behind closed doors they repeated the same words to themselves, it is finished, hoping the river would keep its silence forever. But sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was shallow, plagued by vague dreams of water and shadows. Meanwhile, the river flowed on in silence. Beneath its surface, no sound of struggle lingered, no body rose to float upon its current. The villagers had been right in one regard, the river had swallowed her whole. But the stillness was not finality. It was the silence before a storm, the hush before something long restrained rises up. And though no villager could hear it, the water carried whispers beneath its flow, voices not of the living but of the unseen. They spoke in tones too ancient for human ears, murmuring of injustice, betrayal, and vengeance yet to come. The river was not empty. It was waiting. The river, once a trusted source of life and calm, began to betray its new secret in unsettling ways. The villagers who once drank freely from its banks now noticed the water shifting in unnatural patterns. At dawn, when the sun's first rays usually painted the surface with golden light, the river seemed to resist, its reflections twisting as though the water itself were restless. Fish that once darted joyfully along the shallow edges now swam in deeper channels, refusing to near the shore. Experienced fishermen who cast their nets returned empty-handed, shaking their heads, muttering that the river had grown unfriendly. Even the birds that once perched on nearby reeds circled the area warily, flapping away as if sensing danger that human eyes could not yet see. Some nights, when the moon was bright and silence reigned, villagers swore they heard muffled sounds rising from beneath the water, soft murmurs almost like singing, though no one dared to go closer. A few braver souls, standing near the riverbank, described seeing ripples spread without wind, the surface trembling as if an unseen hand stirred it from below. Mothers forbade their children from playing by the banks, warning them that something strange now lived in the current. The elders, wise but fearful, whispered that the river had taken offense, that the sacrifice made under its surface was not accepted as a gift but resented as a wound. The once ordinary ripples began to feel purposeful, as if carrying a message. They would form circles that spread outward, eerily symmetrical, before breaking apart into jagged lines like a warning. At times, the currents swirled unnaturally, pulling floating leaves into spirals that seemed to vanish into nothingness. The younger men, trying to appear fearless, joked nervously about the river growing hungry. Yet when they dipped their feet to prove their courage, they recoiled in shock, swearing that the water felt colder than it should, colder than any mountain stream, cold enough to numb the bones. Even the animals of the village grew unsettled. Cattle refused to drink from the troughs filled with river water, preferring the stagnant pools left by rainfall. Dogs barked at the sound of splashing, hair rising along their spines. At night, when the village should have been wrapped in peace, the sound of rushing water grew louder, harsher, though the river's level remained the same. It was as though the current carried with it a hidden heartbeat, thudding faintly beneath the waves, echoing in the ears of anyone who listened long enough. The villagers could not ignore these signs. They gathered in anxious circles, whispering theories. Some said a spirit of the drowned had awakened. Others claimed the girl's bond with the river was too strong to be severed, that even in death she had not abandoned it. Still, none dared speak openly of the crime that had taken place, for fear of drawing suspicion or wrath upon themselves. But every ripple, every unnatural swirl, seemed to accuse them silently, making the guilt harder to bury than the girl herself. The river was no longer just water flowing through their land, it had become a mirror of their conscience, restless, disturbed, and waiting. It began subtly, almost as if the river had chosen its moment carefully. At first, a single villager, one who had pushed hardest on the night of betrayal, leaned over the water to drink. As he cupped his hands, he froze. Staring back at him from the rippling surface was not his reflection as it should have been, alive, warm, and familiar, but a version of himself that was cold and lifeless. The face in the water had eyes that did not blink, lips that sagged without breath, and skin pale as though it had been long submerged. He stumbled backward, gasping, insisting he had seen death staring back. The others laughed uneasily, dismissing it as moonlight trickery. Yet the seed of fear had been planted. In the days that followed, more whispers spread. Another conspirator went to wash clothes in the shallows, and as she bent near the river's edge, she screamed, dropping the garments. Her reflection did not mimic her movements but instead stared back at her with a grotesque stillness, the face bloated, waterlogged, and twisted into an unnatural grimace. She ran home shaking, unable to speak of it clearly, but the terror in her eyes spoke louder than words. Soon, no one doubted that the river had turned into something more than water. It had become a living canvas of judgment. The guilty, one by one, were drawn to it against their will. Some claimed the river called to them in their sleep, whispering their names in the rush of its current. Others swore they felt compelled to look, as though invisible hands pulled them to its banks. And each time the water betrayed them. Their reflections appeared not as they were but as they would be, lifeless, swollen, drifting corpses staring blankly upward. What horrified them most was that the reflections often showed details no ordinary trick of the water could create. Rope marks still etched into wrists, eyes glazed with the film of death, mouths twisted in silent cries for air. Fear spread like wildfire. Children no longer played by the river, and even the innocent began to keep their distance, for they feared that the water's curse might not stop with the guilty. But those who had been part of the plot felt its pull more strongly than ever. They could not drink without seeing their dead faces looking back. They could not cross the water without glimpsing pale hands rising toward them from beneath the current. The river had become a mirror that revealed not who they were, but what awaited them. Night after night, the villagers whispered together in trembling voices, wondering what price the river would exact. But the guilty knew deep in their bones that it was no longer a question of if, only when. The reflections did not merely show their deaths. They promised them. It began with a low rumble that no one could quite place. The villagers thought at first it was thunder rolling across the sky, but the heavens were clear, the stars sharp and bright. The sound grew deeper, closer, until the earth itself seemed to vibrate beneath their feet. Then the river stirred, no longer a calm flow of water but a restless, swelling force. Waves lapped against the banks with unnatural urgency, and the once smooth surface writhed as though alive. From its depths, shapes began to form. At first, they were mere shadows dancing in the current, but as the villagers stared, horrified, they took shape into faces, faces everyone recognized. The guilty gasped as they saw their own likenesses rising from the water, not as reflections anymore but as full-bodied corpses drifting with the current. Their drowned selves floated with eyes glazed, hair tangled in weeds, lips pale and open as though calling out in final breathless cries. The water rose higher, as if pulled by a force beyond the moon. It carried these phantom corpses downstream, yet they did not sink or vanish. They bobbed to the surface again and again, grotesque reminders of a fate waiting to claim those who had wronged the innocent girl. Some of the guilty screamed and tried to run, but their spectral doubles followed, carried by the river no matter where they fled along its path. The more they resisted, the more violently the current surged, smashing against rocks and dragging debris into its rising tide. Villagers who had not taken part in the betrayal watched from a distance, clutching each other in fear. They could see the punishment unfolding but dared not interfere, for the river's rage was not theirs to quell. It was no longer water but judgment itself, lifting the images of the guilty in gruesome display. The conspirators tried to deny it, to shout that it was illusion, yet the chilling detail of the corpses, skin bloated, rope burns vivid on wrists, mouths filled with weeds, proved otherwise. By midnight, the river had swollen to its fullest, churning with unnatural fury. The reflections drifted in endless circles, each one belonging to those who had bound the girl and cast her beneath its waters. No one could look away. The river had become their accuser, their executioner, and their grave all at once, and it would not rest until justice was complete. The first wave of terror came quietly, almost like a ripple spreading across still water. When the river rose and carried those grotesque reflections, the drowned, twisted images of the guilty, it left the villagers shaken to their core. At first, only a few had seen it, but word travels swiftly where fear is concerned. Soon, whispers ran from hut to hut, weaving panic into the fabric of the night. The river had become a mirror, and the guilty could no longer escape their own faces staring back at them. At dawn, the village awoke to a strange sight. The river, though calmer than during the night's violent upheaval, still carried with it a haunting energy. The surface glistened in the sunlight, but beneath that brightness lay an unease that made the birds avoid flying near its banks. Villagers crept cautiously toward the water, curious yet terrified. And there, upon the current, more faces began to appear, faces that were unmistakable, faces of those who had laughed, jeered, and shouted for the girl to be banished and drowned. Each reflection was distorted as if seen through a broken mirror, eyes hollow, mouths open in a silent scream, skin pale as though robbed of life. The guilty tried to deny what they saw. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads, muttering that it was trickery, that their minds were betraying them. Others ran into their huts and refused to step outside, covering their windows and doors with cloth as though shutting out the river would make its judgment disappear. Yet the reflections did not relent. They multiplied, appearing wherever water pooled, small puddles near the fields, clay jars filled for drinking, even in the polished surface of gourds. No matter where they turned, the guilty were confronted with their drowned doubles staring back at them. By evening, the village was no longer a place of calm living. It had transformed into a den of hysteria. Women screamed at the sight of their husbands' or brothers' reflections. Children clung to their mothers, sensing the weight of a fear they could not fully understand. The conspirators themselves grew pale and sickly, their eyes hollow with sleeplessness, their hands trembling at the slightest sound of flowing water. The worst came when the river itself seemed to mock them. At nightfall, the sound of rushing water turned into something else, like low, rumbling laughter echoing through the banks. To those who had betrayed the girl, it was unbearable. They swore they heard her voice carried by the current, soft but sharp, whispering words they could not understand yet piercing enough to leave their skin crawling. It was as though she had become one with the river, watching them, calling them to account. One of the ringleaders, a man whose greed had fueled much of the hatred against her, was the first to break. He rushed to the riverbank under the cover of night, shouting apologies into the darkness. Villagers who followed him said he fell to his knees and begged the water to forgive him, swearing he had only acted under pressure. But the river gave no answer. Instead, as the moonlight shone upon its surface, his reflection twisted and changed into a corpse floating beside him. Witnesses say he screamed once, staggered backward, and collapsed lifeless on the ground, foam spilling from his lips. Panic spread like wildfire after his death. The guilty scattered, some fleeing into the fields, others hiding in their homes, yet the curse seemed to follow them everywhere. Sleep became impossible. Each time they closed their eyes, they saw the river swallowing them, pulling them down into its depths. Some woke screaming in the night, clawing at their throats as if drowning in their own dreams. Others refused food and water, terrified to even drink for fear that the reflection at the bottom of their bowl would rise up to choke them. The innocent villagers, the ones who had remained silent during her banishment but had not raised a hand against her, watched with dread. They feared the punishment would not stop with the guilty, that the forest and river alike would consume them all for their cowardice. Their days became filled with tense silence, broken only by wails of the afflicted. No laughter remained in the village, only the constant fear of water's vengeance. As days turned into weeks, the guilty grew fewer in number. Some collapsed suddenly, clutching their chests, their last breath escaping as if stolen by the river's current. Others simply vanished, their huts empty, their footprints leading only as far as the riverbank before stopping abruptly. The water never returned their bodies, only their reflections, grim, swollen, and lifeless, drifting across the current for all to see. The village was no longer ruled by elders or warriors but by fear itself. No one dared approach the river without trembling. Mothers whispered to their children to stay away, yet even then the curse reached them. Pools of rainwater carried the same ghastly images, and the sound of running water in clay pots sent shivers down spines. It became impossible to live as before. Those who had once shouted for the girl's death now whispered only of their own impending doom. Their guilt was written across every reflection, every puddle, every dream. Some went mad, scratching at their own skin to rid themselves of what they thought was the river's touch. Others wept openly, confessing their part in her betrayal, though no confession lightened their burden. By the time the curse had claimed nearly all who had taken part in her banishment, the rest of the village understood the warning too well. No injustice goes unseen, and no crime against the innocent is ever forgotten by the forces of nature. The river, calm as it looked on the surface, had become a living judge, and its judgment was final. The tale of that terror-filled season would be passed down for generations. But in the moment itself, the villagers lived in a waking nightmare. The guilty could not eat, sleep, or drink without seeing their dead selves reflected back at them. Panic had taken root in every home, until the very air of the village stank of fear and guilt. And at the center of it all, the river flowed on, steady and endless, carrying the drowned reflections like trophies of justice. reminders that the innocent girl they had cast beneath its waters would never truly be silenced. The river had always been her sanctuary, the place where she felt safest, where the whispers of the currents soothed her heart and the cool water caressed her hands as if it recognized her soul. Even when she was alive, there was a quiet bond between her and the river, a bond the villagers did not understand. To them it was just water, a tool for farming, for drinking, for survival. But to her it was alive, breathing and listening. That bond did not die the night they bound her and threw her beneath its depths. It only deepened, for the river did not swallow her as a grave. Instead it received her, welcomed her and gave her a new form. When her body sank, it did not thrash or struggle as the guilty had hoped. Instead, the river wrapped her in a gentle embrace, the currents weaving around her limbs like comforting arms. Her breath ceased, yet something greater stirred within her. Her spirit did not rise into the sky, it dissolved into the waters, flowing with the currents, merging with every droplet and ripple. She was no longer a single body but a presence spread throughout the river's vast length, a consciousness interwoven with its timeless flow. Her eyes, though closed in death, opened again in reflection, and from that moment forward, no injustice committed along the river could go unseen. Her spirit had become the current itself, her sorrow the endless song in its waves, her rage the roaring floods, her compassion the quiet trickle that nourished thirsty roots. She was both storm and silence, vengeance and mercy, a living judgment carried by the water. The guilty did not realize this at first. They thought their crime was buried with her beneath the surface, lost forever in the depths. But when their reflections began to twist and appear lifeless upon the river's face, they finally understood. It was not merely water condemning them, it was her. Her spirit watched, remembered and rose against them. Villagers whispered that at night, if you stood by the river long enough, you could see her face staring back at you, pale and sorrowful yet burning with unyielding power. Children were warned never to linger by the banks in the dark, for her voice could slip into your ears, heavy with truths you might not bear. Her presence was not always cruel. To the innocent, the water felt gentler than ever before. Crops flourished when nourished by it, and weary workers swore the river's breeze carried comfort to their hearts. But to the guilty, even the smallest drop was poison, reflecting their sins and hounding their sleep. Her spirit stretched far beyond the village. Streams that branched from the river carried her whispers to distant lands. Travelers claimed to have seen a strange shimmer in the water, or to have heard a soft voice warning them to respect the weak, to never raise hands against the blameless. Some dismissed it as superstition, but others carried the story with reverence, knowing that no human tribunal could be as impartial or as inescapable as the spirit of the river girl. The elders who once condemned her lived their final days in terror. They had mocked her innocence, claiming she was cursed, a danger to the community. But now, each time they approached water, they saw their own fate staring back at them. One by one they fell, some to madness, some to mysterious illness, others simply vanishing near the banks as if swallowed whole. Their huts stood empty, their names erased from the respect of the people, their legacies carried downstream with the mud. Over time, the survivors of the village came to understand her true nature. She had not risen to destroy indiscriminately, only to guard against cruelty. Those who lived with clean hearts found themselves blessed by the river. Their fields yielded richly, their children grew strong, and their homes stood firm even when storms raged. In contrast, any who dared to exploit the weak, who schemed in secrecy or shed innocent blood, soon found themselves haunted by the river's judgment. Generations later, the story of the river girl became one of the most feared and respected legends in the land. Parents told their children, "Do not mock sorrow, do not betray kindness, for the river remembers what people forget." Young men and women approaching the banks would whisper small prayers before touching its waters, asking forgiveness for careless words or thoughts. Even warriors who feared nothing in battle would kneel by the river and lay down their weapons, acknowledging the spirit that dwelled within it. Some say she could still be seen in rare moments, rising in mist when the moon was full, her hair flowing like waves, her eyes neither fully human nor entirely otherworldly. In those moments, the village would fall silent, every soul holding its breath as the mist drifted across the banks. Some believed she looked for new injustices, scanning hearts with a gaze sharper than any blade. Others swore she came only to ensure that her people lived with fairness, her sorrow a reminder but her presence a protection. The river itself became sacred, its waters no longer seen as mere resources but as a living force of balance. No one dared pollute it, no one dared misuse its gift. Fishermen prayed before casting nets, promising to take only what they needed. Farmers blessed their fields with words of gratitude before diverting its streams. For all knew that if they forgot respect, if they returned to cruelty, the spirit would awaken once more, not with gentle ripples this time, but with storms strong enough to wash away an entire village. Thus the girl who was once betrayed, mocked, and drowned found a legacy far greater than her enemies had ever imagined. She did not vanish into silence. She became the silence between ripples, the voice within floods, the endless guardian against injustice. The river, eternal and watchful, carried her presence forward. And wherever it flowed, her spirit ensured that no cruelty, no jealousy, and no crime against the innocent would ever sink unnoticed again. Would you like me to expand this closing into a darker, more haunting ending, where her spirit actively hunts even beyond the river? Or keep it as balanced justice, where she punishes only the guilty and protects the innocent?